The following Truth Barista podcast is a High Beam Ministry production.
Did you know misogynists are much more common than you think? It's true, but it's actually kind of incredibly hard to spot some of them. They themselves often don't even realize they have this unconscious distaste towards women that typically forms in early life.
Truth is getting harder to find today, but there is no shortage of it here on the Truth Barista podcast. Spread the word. We deal with the uncompromised truth in every podcast. We are a High Beam Ministry production.
Welcome to the Erzatz Coffee Shop. This is Jay, your Truth Barista, and I'm serving up a steamy cup of God's truth for the average Joe. You can catch me and this podcast on my websites, truthbarista.com, all one word, truthbarista.com, and highbeamministry.com. That's HIGHBEAM ministry.com, as in car high beam. We're shining the light of God's truth on the road ahead.
Truth Barista, we've been talking about misogynistic people. And, of course, let's talk about defining that word, because not everyone knows what a misogynistic is. It's not a masseuse or a massage, right?
That's right. It's not a massage. Somebody who is misogynistic or a misogynist is somebody who has a disdain for or a hatred for women or girls, okay? And this is really a terrible accusation to level against any man. You've really got to be a vile human being to get to the point where you're a misogynist. So this is one of those things where it's like looking at somebody and saying, you're a Nazi. I mean, once you get to the point of that in the conversation, the argument implodes and it's really ridiculous. So unless you're absolutely sure somebody hates women or holds them in great disdain, don't even think about using that phrase. And it's especially wrong to use it against God. Because God created women and God is love. There is no possible way that God can hate or disdain his own creation.
I heard a psychologist once say that a misogynistic person is and can be a rapist, because rape isn't about sex, it's about controlling and dominating. And
right.
That comes, I think, or this psychologist was saying, that came out of that hatred for women. So there is some connection there, I think.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there's nothing loving about forcing a sexual experience upon another person. It is an act of hatred. So in a nutshell, yeah, that's what it is. So
okay, so let's address this idea that God is a misogynistic God. Somehow he puts women in a second-class citizenship. That's just not true, is it?
It is not true. Remember, we described the situation in Genesis, the ideal, okay? Well, and then we talked about Revelation and the ideal that God is going to return men and women back to the original pattern. What we haven't talked about is what's all this in between. So you have a mountain on one side, a mountain on the other, and this very deep, dark valley in between. And it begins to answer the question, why does it seem the Bible treats women as second-class persons of less value than men? This is my premise. The Bible doesn't treat women as second-class citizens. It doesn't degrade them. It records what the culture is doing. So the Bible is not advocating it. The Bible is describing it. And let me show you where this begins to kick in. The very first evidence of this happens to be in the book of Genesis. Okay. We are in the middle of a fallen world. There are already in Genesis 6 generations from Adam. He has this interesting descendant named Lamech, Lamech. Okay. Mankind has now divorced themselves from God's standard. They have now begun to exercise this subdue and rule, this conquer and dominate over one another, men over women specifically. And all of a sudden you have Lamech who pops up and he has two wives, Ada and Zillah. And this is not Godzilla, or Bridezilla. It's just Zilla. Okay. Just having a little fun there, trying to keep it light. Okay. God's original plan is one man, one woman. But now you have Lamech, which is one man, two women. And this is not according to God's plan. Why does he have two women? The answer is because he can't. He wants to. Okay. We're not seeing God advocating this in any way. God has already set his standard with the man and the woman. Here, the Bible is recording how humanity, the cultures are beginning to degrade, and men are collecting women in multiple partnerships. even today, which is funny because we call ourselves, our society is enlightened and we're evolving and we're going forward back to polygamy. We're going forward back to polyamory. We call ourselves progressives. Actually, in this whole polyamory, multiple partners, one man with multiple women, it is not progressive. It is regressive.
Well, it also doesn't make sense to me because women seemingly want their own identity. Why would you want the identity of with one man with all these other women? I mean, to me, that's regression, right? I mean, that doesn't bring any uniqueness to you as an individual, as a woman, to share one man with, however many
sister wives you want.
Yeah, however many the harem is, but that doesn't make sense, and yet like you say, we are moving in that direction.
Well, think of this. A harem, as is classic in the Middle East, is a sign of power. It's not necessarily about sex, it's power. It's about alliances. Kings had multiple wives from other kings' families as an alliancing. Again, it goes back to maintaining power. Just from my observation, looking at society as a whole, there are people who don't want to be in charge. They like to be under somebody's charge. They want to be protected. They want to be cared for. And I'm just going to be blunt here. Why is the welfare state so popular around the Western societies right now? Because people want to be cared for. They want to take an easier path. And you have people in power who are more than willing to give them that if those under their power will give them more power. So you start looking at these polyamory situations and you can say, oh, okay, well, it's just because they love each other so deeply. Horse hockey, okay? Or whatever you want to say at that point. I think if you get into the pathology, I would like to interview some of these women and some of these men saying, really, okay, enough of the superficial stuff. What are you really looking for? What are you really desiring in this relationship? And some people like it because, hey, you get multiple people living in a household, multiple incomes coming in. Everybody gets to live in a high standard of living. They just have to trade off the idea of multiple sex partners and complicated relationships to get that. I understand it. Just be honest with it. Okay. So anyway, getting back to what we were talking about, the Genesis thing, Lamech is beginning to show he's exercising this misogyny, in a sense, by having more than one wife, dividing his marital loyalties between two women. And in fact, when you hear what he says in this event, a guy insulted me, so I killed him. That's the situation. Going, this guy's really over the top. He is out of control. He is out of God's control. So not only is he now conquering and dominating other human beings, and death being the ultimate way to do that, killing somebody, but he is now violating the reproduce command by having more than one wife. So here we see the Bible not advocating it, but recording it. Does that make sense to you?
Well, yeah, he was a quintessential narcissist, wasn't he? I mean, he saw himself as the center of the universe, and that's what happens when God isn't involved, right? You go back to narcissistic kind of behavior.
I think that's a great take on it. I think you could probably say he's the first narcissist. Okay, well, what about here? Let's advance a little farther through the Old Testament, and we can kind of roll through the whole book if you want. And in general, we see men take the lead in the stories of Abraham. There's Abraham as the hero, his partner Sarah. You see Isaac, the patriarch, and his wife. And you have Jacob, the patriarch, and his two wives, Rachel and Leah. However, you have to understand in Judaism, they do recognize Sarah's as important as Abraham because without Sarah, there would be no chosen people. So now you have the patriarch and the matriarch, and that's more, isn't that interesting? In the cultures of the day, you had the patriarch and his wife. But in the Bible now, you're seeing God calling both the patriarch and the matriarch into the work of doing what? Reproducing. And he's going to create a nation out of these people. They will subdue and rule Canaan and start God's people in that land. In a sense, Israel's work, being God's people in the land of Canaan, is kind of like an echo of Eden. Take over the land, subdue it, rule it, and together fill it full of people in order to manage it well. Only Genesis 2, do it God's way.
Well, these patriarchs, before we go to coffee here, and get some coffee, I should say, these patriarchs, they seem to have the upper hand, the rule. But was that rule to dominate, or was that rule to protect and provide? I mean, there's a difference there, right? There's one thing to have a woman under your thumb, so to speak, and it's another thing to sort of rule benevolently with provision and for protection and that sort of thing. Isn't that more of the way these patriarchs operated?
Exactly. I mean, when you look at the biblical record, you don't see Abraham abusing Sarah, you don't see Isaac abusing Rebekah, and you don't see Jacob abusing Rachel and Leah. Although with the issue of Leah, Jacob definitely favored Rachel. Okay. But what you do see in Abraham and you do see in Isaac is this event where they move to a foreign area right next to the land because they're experiencing a famine in their own land. They move down to the land of the Philistines, and in order to protect his wife, and also to ensure she stays his wife and he stays alive. So there's more than just one thing involved in this. Abraham and Isaac both tell their wives, if the Philistines say, that's his wife, we'll kill him and take the wife. And so you say you're my sister, kind of a thing. So there is that protective aspect part of the story. But you have to understand in those days too, it's the woman who ran the household. It's the woman who ran the tent. She was as much of the management of the household as the man was the management of the flock, the assets. So here you have Sarah running the household, calling the shots regarding the Hagar incident. Rebekah ran the household. In fact, Rebekah, in the whole birthright and blessing issue in Genesis, she proves to be more spiritually aware than her husband, Isaac, who is losing his physical eyesight as well as his spiritual eyesight. She's actually more of a hero in the story than he is. And then when you get to Jacob, and I'm getting really excited here, Jacob gets snowed, winds up with two women, and these two women are right in with him when he says, I think it's time to leave your father and get the heck out of here because he doesn't like me anymore. And the women are going, yeah, Jacob, let's do it. We're no longer his daughters. He doesn't care for us. Let's get out of here. So why would the women want to go run off with a misogynist? It was actually kind of their father that was doing this. The upshot of all this, again, is the Bible is not promoting it. It's simply recording it. It's the culture that needs to be changed. It's not the Bible. However, the Bible has some wonderful things to say protecting women, making sure that misogyny and abuse and sexual abuse and violence and disparities and unfairness are dealt with and kept within boundaries. It is remarkable. And if you want to, over the next couple meetings in the booth here, we can go through some of those scriptures and you will be blown away.
Well, that's exactly what I want to do. But in the meantime, you were talking about a shot here and a shot there. I need a shot in my coffee cup, and I'm going to go do that right now. And when we come back, we'll continue this conversation.
Let me espresso my love. Gesundheit. I'm in love with a coffee bean. A Tanzanian pea, berry, celebi, scalosi is what a bean ought to be. No, recaffeinated, double decaf or a half a caffeinated for me. Cause I want a latte. I want a lot of caffeine.
The Truth Barista podcast, set in the imaginary Ersatz coffee shop next to Big Brain University. The Truth Barista podcast tackles a plethora of scintillating topics. We don't shy away from controversy, whether it's current cultural issues, questions about Bible verses, or even just some banter to encourage you. Jay the Truth Barista and Amazing Larry brew up highly caffeinated talk times.
We are two wild and crazy guys.
Grab a cup of joe, plop yourself down in the booth next to us, and get ready to think. The Truth Barista Podcast, a production of High Beam Ministry, highbeamministry.com.
Okay, boy, we've been talking, Truth Barista, about these patriarchs. I mean, these are the heavy hitters, of the Bible. But Jacob, here's a guy that broke with tradition. He's got 2 wives. I know he got kind of tricked into it, but nevertheless, he's got 2 of those wives.
Okay. Actually, what you said was a bit inaccurate. He didn't break with tradition. He was actually following tradition.
2 wives?
Human tradition.
Oh.
Human. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. You tricked me.
Yeah. Culture allowed for multiple wives. Again, the Bible isn't mandating it. The Bible is simply recording it. So let's get into some of these scriptures. Just kind of dip our toe in the water, shall we?
Okay. Well, Truth Barista, you know me. I don't believe God is a misogynistic God. But really, there's some things in the Bible here, and I'm going to give you an example, that are really strange. I mean, really strange. And I know only you can solve the strangeness. So here goes.
Why, thank you.
This is Exodus 21:7. It says, when a man sells his daughter as a concubine, she is not to leave as the male slaves do. So, is God giving the okay to sell women? Is he in the human trafficking business?
Oh, I can see that you're trying to capture me in a quandary here. It's actually pretty easy to be solved. You are right. When you begin to look, and this is in the Torah, this is in the law. So now, based on this verse, people can say, well, God is obviously misogynistic. He is obviously has some disdain for women because he's allowing them to be sold. Let's remember, we're starting with a culture that's being recorded. So what is the Bible now doing regarding this culture? You got it?
Okay, sure. Okay.
This is about context. This is a culture of the day context. This is a case of contracting a daughter with the hope of a resulting marriage. And you're going, I can see this funny look on your face. You're going, where the heck do you get concubine?
Well,
and equating that with like a male slave.
I mean, a concubine is a prostitute.
No, she is not. She is a wife. She is a secondary wife. She is a wife on probation, so to speak, an auxiliary wife besides the first wife. She can also be a first wife that's in a trial, quote unquote, process. And no, do not go to she's being checked out sexually, okay? Because that's not what it is. It's something different, okay? Shall I explain?
Well, you should, because I always thought that a concubine wasn't really a wife. And if you're having sex, for example, with a concubine that's not your wife, that's kind of adultery.
See, what you're thinking is you're evaluating the Bible in today's culture, not their culture. You have to take it from the starting culture, and here it is. The context is Exodus 21. And if you look in your Bible there, it talks about in Exodus 21, buying a Hebrew slave. This is a problem if you don't know the language. You can never make a slave out of a fellow Hebrew or out of a fellow Israelite. You can't do that. You go to God's law and it says that is prohibited. You can have a slave from another nation, another people, a Gentile nation, etc. Again, it's simply recognizing the culture of that day. It's not mandating it, okay? So you can make a slave of a foreign nation, but you can't make a slave of a fellow citizen. So obviously, how do you have somebody who is hired as a servant to serve your household who is not a slave? You see, a slave serves without compensation. You do have to care for them, because if you don't, they're going to die and you don't have a slave. This is different. This is a servant. This is like an indentured servant. Here's the situation. People in those days can sell their services in the case of escaping poverty. So let's say we have a rich family with a man over here who is unmarried, or he may be married and the culture allows him to have another wife. Over here, you have a family that is destitute. It's in poverty. The flock died and there's only enough land to be able to support the husband and wife, but not the daughter. The situation is the rich man's family can say to that, I'll hire your daughter. In fact, I think she's really attractive and I'd like to have her as a wife. I will hire her and it will be a probationary type experience, like an indentured servant. And during this time, I'm going to see how she runs the household. In exchange for that, she is due food, clothing. If we happen to be married, it demands marital intimacy. but then she'll work for me. And in the process, she will pay off a debt that this poor family may owe, or I help the poor family out by caring for her daughter. Okay. It's not one-sided. In fact, even regarding slaves, foreign slaves now, not an indentured servant, rabbis say this about the responsibilities of hiring a servant. He who buys a slave buys a master. It's more about the responsibility on the head of the household to care for the servant than it is for the servant or the slave to fulfill their job in the household.
Now, Truth Barista, you have given us some cultural insight that I think most people don't have. All of my life, I thought concubine was not an indentured servant, but more of a secondary sex wife, somebody that had to do with sex. And really what you're saying, no, that isn't the case at all.
No, maybe indentured servant might not be the best way of saying it, but look at Abraham and Sarah. Hagar, as you would say it, the Egyptian, was Abraham's concubine. She is an auxiliary wife. She helped care for the household. She helped care for the kids. She did the cooking. She managed the house alongside Sarah. Sarah is in charge as the lead wife over the whole situation. Hagar was not just there to have children. The only reason Abraham had sex with Hagar, was to produce a child because Sarah was still barren. So sex was not the primary thing with Hagar. It was kind of like the final thought with Hagar. When you look at other wives, like Solomon had numerous concubines. Those concubines, he had sex, of course. But the point was alliances. They were there to help with the household as well, the palace, these things. It was a power structure. So we got to get our minds out of this. I'm just hiring a woman to have sex. She's just a glorified prostitute. That's not what a concubine is. Okay, so let me reiterate this. Exodus 21 is about getting a Hebrew slave. Get rid of the word slave, put in servant, an indentured servant. If slavery is prohibited regarding a man, it certainly applies to a woman. You can't have a Hebrew or Israelite woman as your slave. However, in this scripture, it clearly shows that she is being vetted, so to speak, as a marriage prospect. Look at here, verse 7. When a man sells his daughter as a concubine, she is not to leave as the male slaves do. This is indicating a different case. Verse 2 through 4 talks about the master giving his male servant a wife so that the man can leave with or without his family at the end of the term. Because of the context, this is also about marriage and family. Here it is. If she is displeasing to her master, and here it is, who chose her for himself. There's the marriage prospect right there. Then he must let her be redeemed. In other words, paid to return her back to her family. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has acted treacherously toward her. He broke the contract. He broke his promise. He broke his intention to marry her. So this has nothing to do with treating a woman as a slave. It has everything to do with marriage prospects or to help a family out if they're destitute. These are acts of love to protect the woman from being sold off as a slave. She has to be returned to her family, not further isolated from her family.
Well, and I think that's the misunderstanding, isn't it? I mean, it is really to protect the woman from abuse. As you're saying, I mean, to me, that's a God of love rather than a God that's misogynistic.
The master chose her for himself. That means marriage prospect. If it doesn't work out, she must be brought back to her family, which means he paid money to the family to see how she would work out as his wife running the household. He is not allowed to sell her to a foreigner as a slave to recoup his money. No Israelite, according to Leviticus 25:42, was to sell another Israelite outside of the nation. Here's another one. If you read further down, it says, or if he chooses her for his son. That's marriage language. That's another prospect. He bought this girl. He paid a bride price for the girl so that she could become his son's wife. If the trial period is a prospect for his son, it also says here, he must treat her as a daughter, not as an outsider. He must deal with her according to the customary treatment of daughters, is what it says. So how do we expect a man or a father to treat his daughter? With love and respect. If he has purchased this gal, this wonderful young lady, for his son as a marriage prospect, that means he can't touch her. He won't touch her. He will provide food. He will provide clothing. He will provide relationship. He will protect her. He will be a father to her while she is finding out and her son is finding out if this is a marriage prospect that will work. This is not slavery. It is not abuse language, nor can it be used to sanction any kind of abuse. And finally, in the same section, it says this, and this is going to blow your mind. Again, Scripture is not mandating it, the culture. It is reflecting, recording the culture. If he takes an additional wife, he must not reduce the food, clothing, or marital rights. That's sex for the first wife. If he does not do these three things for her, she may leave free of charge without any payment. First, more than one wife is a cultural allowance. It's not God's plan. That will take time to restore over time. We see that in the New Testament. Second, the husband can't reduce her support to help him support his new hottie. Okay? That first wife is still due what he promised her and what he is under obligation to give her. Food, clothing, and marital intimacy. Period. Do you see how God is sticking up for a destitute woman? Maybe the wife has gotten a little less attractive in her older age and he wants somebody young. Well, too bad, mister. You got to give that first wife your full support and your full attention if you're going to enter into another relationship with a secondary hottie.
Well, like you were saying, I think it's very good that the Bible isn't condoning this behavior. The culture is doing it, and so he is just protecting the woman against the cultural norm. That's what a loving father does.
This gets profound when you read through it, because all of a sudden you realize the culture abuses women. God is protecting the women.
Absolutely. Always has been that way and always will be.
By the way, do you remember the phrase in weddings? We used to hear it a lot. Don't hear it so much anymore because they've changed the language. Do you promise to love, honor, and cherish your wife?
Yes, okay. I do remember that. Yes.
When you go back into the Old English, where that came from, love, honor, and cherish your wife, that directly relates back to this verse and this phrase where you give her food, clothing, and marital intimacy.
Wow. Providing. Isn't that something?
You are to provide for your wife for all of her needs. And so here you look at Christianity and it's like, is Christianity misogynist? No. It's making the man promise to do everything that he was called to promise back in the Old Testament that God expected back in Genesis 1.
So, Truth Barista, it's so exciting to hear all these good things, and man, I'm telling you, you're unpacking some truths that I think most of us have never heard. But we're going to do more of it. We'll do it the next time we get together.
We are presenting God's truth for our day. You're listening to The Truth Barista, a production of highbeamministry.com.
This is Jay, your Truth Barista. Thanks for listening to the Truth Barista podcast. The best way to find out when a new podcast drops is through RSS feed. Go to our website, look for the RSS button, press it, and then enter your email. You'll be notified when a new podcast drops. Thanks for listening.